Pythagoras of Samos was an Ionian Greek philosopher, mathematician, and has been credited as the founder of the movement called Pythagoreanism. Most of the information about Pythagoras was written down centuries after he lived, so very little reliable information is known about him. He was born on the island of Samos, and traveled, visiting Egypt and Greece, and maybe India, and in 520 BC returned to Samos. Around 530 BC, he moved to Croton in Magna Graecia, and there established some kind of school or guild. Pythagoras made influential contributions to philosophy and religion in the late 6th century BC. He is often revered as a great mathematician and scientist, and is best known for the Pythagorean theorem which bears his name. However, because legend and obfuscation cloud his work even more than that of the other pre-Socratic philosophers, one can give only a tentative account of his teachings, and some have questioned whether he contributed much to mathematics and natural philosophy. Many of the accomplishments credited to Pythagoras may actually have been accomplishments of his colleagues and successors. Some accounts mention that the philosophy associated with Pythagoras was related to mathematics and that numbers were important. It was said that he was the first man to call himself a philosopher or lover of wisdom, and Pythagorean ideas exercised a marked influence on Plato, and through him, all of Western philosophy. Life. According to Clement of Alexandria, Pythagoras was a disciple of Socrates, the Egyptian arch-prophet, and Plato of Secnuphus of Heliopolis. Herodotus, Isocrates, and other early writers agree that Pythagoras was the son of Nicarchus, born on a Greek island in the eastern Aegean called Samos. Pythagoras's father was a gem engraver or a merchant from Tyre. Pythagoras's name led him to be associated with Pythian Apollo. Aristippus explained his name by saying, "He spoke the truth no less than did the Pythian," and Iamblichus tells the story that the Pythia prophesied that his pregnant mother would give birth to a man supremely beautiful, wise, and beneficial to humankind. A late source gives his mother's name as Pythagoras. As to the date of his birth, Aristoxenus stated that Pythagoras left Samos in the reign of Polycrates at the age of 40, which would give a date of birth around 570 BC. Pythagoras's later fate is unknown and inconsistent among ancient sources. Some say that he perished in the temple with his disciples, others that he fled first to Tarentum, and that, being driven from there, he escaped to Metapontum, and there, according to Diogenes Laertius, starved himself to death. His tomb was shown at Metapontum in the time of Cicero. According to Walter Burkert, most obvious is the contradiction between Aristoxenus and Dicaeus regarding the catastrophe that overwhelmed the Pythagorean society. One of the two reports must be basically wrong. Either Pythagoras withdrew to Metapontum before the outbreak of the unrest and died there, or he and his followers were hounded from city to city. Like his doctrines, the life of Pythagoras also becomes a mirror image of real controversies in the schools. On the one hand, there is the controversy over the primacy of the theoretical or practical life. In this respect, Heraclides thinks Pythagoras as the apostle of pure theory. There is not a single detail in the life of Pythagoras that stands uncontradicted, but it is possible, from a more or less critical selection of the data, to construct a plausible account. Quote, according to Iamblichus, in the life of Pythagoras, translated by Thomas Taylor, 22 years Pythagoras remained in Egypt, pursuing closely his investigations, visiting every place famous for its teachings, every person celebrated for wisdom. Astronomy and geometry he especially studied, and he was thoroughly initiated in all the mysteries of the gods, till, having been taken captive by the soldiers of Cambyses, he was carried to Babylon. Here the Magi instructed him in the venerable knowledge, and he arrived at the summit of arithmetic, music and other disciplines. After 12 years he returned to Samos, being then about 56 years of age. Family. According to some accounts, Pythagoras married Theano, a lady of Croton. Theano was also a philosopher, and said to have first been Pythagoras' pupil. According to Mary Ritterbeard, Theano told Hippodamus of Thurium that her treatise on virtue contained the doctrine of the golden mean. According to the Sleph, Stobaeus and Hieron, in On Piety, Theano read that, "I have learned that many of the Greeks believe Pythagoras said all things are generated from number. The very assertion poses a difficulty. How can things which do not exist even be conceived to generate? But he did not say that all things come to be from number, rather, in accordance with number, on the grounds that order in the primary sense is in number, and it is by participation, in order that a first and a second and the rest sequentially are assigned to things which are counted. The children are variously stated to have included a son, Telish, and 3 daughters, Damo, Arinote, and Maia. Milo was said to be an associate of Pythagoras. One story tells of the wrestler saving the philosopher's life when a roof was about to collapse. Arinote wrote a Bacchica concerning the mysteries of Demeter, and a work called The Rites of Dionysus. Among the Pythagorean sacred discourses there is a dictum attributed to Arinote: "The eternal essence of number is the most providential cause of the whole heaven, earth and the region in between. Likewise it is the root of the continued existence of the gods and daemons, as well as that of divine men." Brewer mentioned that Pythagoras taught that the sun is a movable sphere in the center of the universe, and that all the planets revolve round it. Thus, it would appear that Arinote's quote above is not entirely in alignment with his model of the universe, since it is limited to Earth orbit. Influence. Before 520 BC, on one of his visits to Egypt to Greece, Pythagoras might have met the c. 54 years older Thales of Miletus. Thales was a philosopher, scientist, mathematician, and engineer, also known for the Thales theorem. Pythagoras' birthplace, the island of Samos, is situated in the northeast Aegean Sea not far from Miletus. In the absence of reliable information, however, a huge range of teachers were assigned to Pythagoras. Some made his training almost entirely Greek, others exclusively Egyptian and Oriental. We find mentioned as his instructors Creophilus, Hermodamas of Samos, Thales, Anaximander, and Pherecydes of Saros. In Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, Diogenes Laertius cites the statement of Aristoxenus that the Delphic Themistoclea taught Pythagoras his moral doctrines. Aristoxenus says that Pythagoras got most of his moral doctrines from the Delphic priestess Themistoclea. Porphyry calls her Aristoclea, and wrote, "He taught much else, which he claimed to have learned from Aristoclea at Delphi." The Egyptians are said to have taught him geometry, the Phoenicians arithmetic, the Chaldeans astronomy, the Magians the principles of religion and practical maxims for the conduct of life. Of the various claims regarding his Greek teachers, Pherecydes of Saros is mentioned most often. According to R.D. Hicks, Pythagoras not only visited Egypt and learned the Egyptian language, but also journeyed among the Chaldeans and Magi. Later in Crete, he went to the cave of Ida with Epimenides, and entered Egyptian sanctuaries for the purpose to learn information concerning the secret lore of the different gods. Plutarch asserted in his book on Isis and Osiris that during his visit to Egypt, Pythagoras received instruction from the Egyptian priest Enufis of Heliopolis. Other ancient writers asserted his visit to Egypt. Enough of Egypt was known to attract the curiosity of an inquiring Greek, and contact between Samos and other parts of Greece with Egypt is mentioned. Ancient authorities note the similarities between the religious and ascetic peculiarities of Pythagoras with the Orphic Cretan mysteries, or the Delphic oracle. Views there is little direct evidence as to the kind and amount of knowledge which Pythagoras acquired, or as to his definite philosophical views. Everything of the kind mentioned by Plato and Aristotle is attributed not to Pythagoras but to the Pythagoreans. Heraclitus stated that he was a man of extensive learning, and Xenophanes claimed that he believed in the transmigration of souls. Xenophanes mentions the story of his interceding on behalf of a dog that was being beaten, professing to recognize in its cries the voice of a departed friend. Pythagoras is supposed to have claimed that he had been Euphorbus, the son of Panthus, in the Trojan War, as well as various other characters, a tradesman, a courtesan, etc. In his book The Life of Apollonius of Tyana, Philostratus read that Pythagoras knew not only who he was himself but also who he had been. Many mathematical and scientific discoveries were attributed to Pythagoras, including his famous theorem, as well as discoveries in the field of music, astronomy, and medicine. It is mentioned that the people of Croton were supposed to have identified him with the Hyperborean Apollo, and he was said to have practiced divination and prophecy. In the visits to various places in Greece, Delos, Sparta, Phlius, Crete, etc., which are ascribed to him, he usually appears either in his religious or priestly guise, or else as a lawgiver. Excerpt from a speech by the character Aristotle in Protrepticus. This is the thing for the sake of which nature and the God engendered us. So what is this thing? When Pythagoras was asked, he said, to observe the heavens, and he used to claim that he himself was an observer of nature, and it was for the sake of this that he had passed over into life. And they say that when somebody asked Anaxagoras for what reason anyone might choose to come to be and be alive, he replied to the question by saying, to observe the heavens and the stars in it, as well as moon and sun, since everything else at any rate is worth nothing. Croton. After his travels, Pythagoras moved to Croton in Italy. Possibly the tyranny of Polycrates in Samos made it difficult for him to achieve his schemes there. His later admirers claimed that Pythagoras was so overburdened with public duties in Samos, because of the high estimation in which he was held by his fellow citizens, that he moved to Croton. On his arrival in Croton, he quickly attained extensive influence, and many people began to follow him. Later biographers tell fantastical stories of the effects of his eloquent speech in leading the people of Croton to abandon the luxurious and corrupt way of life and devote themselves to the purer system which he came to introduce. According to Diogenes Laertius, his followers established a select brotherhood, a club for the purpose of pursuing the religious and ascetic practices which developed. According to Diogenes Laertius, what was done and taught among the members was kept of secret. The esoteric teachings may have concerned science and mathematics, or religious doctrines, and may have been connected with the worship of Apollo. Temperance of all kinds seems to have been strictly urged. There is disagreement among the biographers as to whether Pythagoras forbade all animal food, or only certain types. The club was in practice at once a philosophical school, a religious brotherhood, and a political association. Conflict seems to have broken out between the towns of Sybaris and Croton. The forces of Croton were headed by the Pythagorean Milo, and it is likely that the members of the brotherhood took a prominent part. After the decisive victory by Croton, a proposal for establishing a more democratic constitution was unsuccessfully resisted by the Pythagoreans, their enemies, headed by Cylon and Ninon, the former of whom is said to have been irritated by his exclusion from the brotherhood, roused the populace against them. An attack was made upon them while assembled either in the house of Milo, or in some other meeting place. The building was set on fire, and many of the assembled members perished, only the younger and more active escaping. Similar commotions ensued in the other cities of Magna Graecia in which Pythagorean clubs had been formed. As an active and organized brotherhood, the Pythagorean order was everywhere suppressed, and did not again revive. Still, the Pythagoreans continued to exist as a sect, the members of which kept up among themselves the religious observances and scientific pursuits, while individuals, as in the case of Archytas, acquired now and then great political influence. Writings. No texts by Pythagoras are known to have survived, although forgeries under his name, a few of which remain extant, did circulate in antiquity. Critical ancient sources like Aristotle and Aristophanes cast doubt on these writings. Ancient Pythagoreans usually quoted the master's doctrines with the phrase autos ephe, emphasizing the essentially oral nature of his teaching. According to Sir William Smith, it appears, in fact, from this, as well as from the extant fragments, that the first book of the work contained a general account of the origin and arrangement of the universe. The second book appears to have been an exposition of the nature of numbers, which in the Pythagorean theory are the essence and source of all things. Religion and science. Heraclides Ponticus reports the story that Pythagoras claimed that he had lived 4 previous lives that he could remember in detail. One of his past lives, as reported by Aulus Gellius, was as a beautiful courtesan. According to Xenophanes, Pythagoras heard the cry of his dead friend in the bark of a dog. Brewitt wrote, Pythagoras maintained that the soul has 3 vehicles: the ethereal, which is luminous and celestial, in which the soul resides in a state of bliss in the stars; the luminous, which suffers the punishment of sin after death; and the terrestrial, which is the vehicle it occupies on this earth. Quote, Pythagoras asserted he could write on the moon. His plan of operation was to write on a looking-glass in blood, and place it opposite the moon, when the inscription would appear photographed or reflected on the moon's disk. Quote, Mesmerism was practiced by Pythagoras, if we may credit Iamblichus, who tells us that he tamed a savage Daunian bear by stroking it gently with his hand, subdued an eagle by the same means, and held absolute dominion over beasts and birds by the power of his voice, or influence of his touch. Pythagoras taught that the sun is a movable sphere in the center of the universe, and that all the planets revolve round it. This is substantially the same as the Copernican and Newtonian systems. Quote, the Pythian games were held by the Greeks at Pytha in Phasis, subsequently called Delphi. They took place every 4th year, the second of each Olympiad. Law. Pythagoras became the subject of elaborate legends surrounding his historic persona. Aristotle described Pythagoras as a wonder-worker and somewhat of a supernatural figure, attributing to him such aspects as a golden thigh, which he showed to Abris, the Hyperborean priests, and exhibited in the Olympic Games. According to Muslim tradition, Pythagoras was said to have been initiated by Hermes. Brewitt wrote, Pythagoras maintained that he distinctly recollected having occupied other human forms before his birth at Samos. He was Aethalides, son of Mercury, Euphorbos the Phrygian, son of Panthus, in which form he ran Patroclus through with a lance, leaving Hector to dispatch the hateful friend of Achilles, Hermotimos, the prophet of Clazomenae, and a fisherman. To prove his Phrygian existence he was taken to the temple of Hera in Argos, and asked to point out the shield of the son of Panthus, which he did without hesitation. Pythagoreanism. Both Plato and Isocrates affirmed that, above all else, Pythagoras was famous for leaving behind him a way of life. According to Timaeus of Locri, he was the first to say, "Friends have all things in common and friendship is a quality." Brewitt wrote, "In deadly hostility, ready to fight each other with swords. Poke not fire with the sword." This was a precept of Pythagoras, meaning add not fuel to fire, or do not irritate an angry man by sharp words which will only increase his rage. According to Walter Burkert, the history of Pythagoreanism was already, at that time, the laborious reconstruction of something lost and gone. It is only post-Aristotelian sources that biographical and historical details regarding Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans are to be found. Pythagorean school. According to Iamblichus, in the life of Pythagoras there were also two forms of philosophy. For the two genera of those that pursued it, the acousmatici and the mathematician, the latter are acknowledged to be Pythagoreans by the rest, but the mathematician do not admit that the acousmatici derived their instructions from Pythagoras but from Hippasus. The philosophy of the acousmatici consisted in auditions unaccompanied with demonstrations and a reasoning process, because it merely ordered a thing to be done in a certain way, and that they should endeavor to preserve such other things as were said by him, as divine dogmas. Memory was the most valued faculty. All these auditions were of three kinds, some signifying what a thing is, others what it especially is, others what ought or ought not to be done. The best of all legislators came from the school of Pythagoras, Charondas, the Catanian, Zaleucus and Timoratus, as well as many others, who established laws with great benevolence and political science. The whole Pythagorean school produced appropriate songs, which they called exartices or adaptations, cinemage or elegance of manners and apophia contact, usefully conducting the dispositions of the soul to passions contrary to those which it before possessed. By musical sounds alone, unaccompanied with words, they healed the passions of the soul and certain diseases, enchanting in reality, as they say. It is probable that from hence this name epode, enchantment, came to be generally used. For his disciples, Pythagoras used divinely contrived mixtures of diatonic, chromatic and inharmonic melodies, through which he easily transferred and circularly led the passions of the soul in a contrary direction, when they had recently and in an irrational and secret manner been formed, such as sorrow, rage and pity, absurd emulation and fear, all various desires, angers and appetites, pride, supineness and vehemence. Each of these he corrected through the rule of virtue, attempering them through appropriate melodies, as well as through certain salubrious medicine. Carl B. Boyer mentioned that the Pythagorean school of thought was politically conservative and with a strict code of conduct. Leonid Zhmud identified two camps with the early Pythagoreans, the scientific mathematician and the religious acousmatici, who were engaged in politics. According to Riedwig and Rendel, who cite antiphon reports, the school name was Semicircle, a place to discuss common interest topics among Samians. Outside of Samos he adapted a cave where he studied and lived day and night, discoursing with a few of his associates. In Samos he may have instructed the small athlete Eurymenes to eat a certain amount of meat every day. Both Iamblichus and Porphyry give detailed accounts of the organization of the school, although the primary interest of both writers is not historical accuracy, but rather to present Pythagoras as a divine figure, sent by the gods to benefit humankind. Pythagoras set up an organization which was in some ways a school, in some ways a brotherhood, and in some ways a monastery. It was based upon the religious teachings of Pythagoras and was very secretive. The adherents were bound by a vow to Pythagoras and each other, for the purpose of pursuing the religious and ascetic observances, and of studying his religious and philosophical theories. There is mentioning of an oath on the Tetractes. There were ascetic practices. Some represent Pythagoras as forbidding all animal food, advocating a plant-based diet, and prohibiting consumption of beans. This may have been due to the doctrine of metempsychosis. Other authorities contradict the statement. According to Aristoxenus, he allowed the use of all kinds of animal food except the flesh of oxen used for plowing, and rams. There is a similar discrepancy as to the prohibition of fish and beans, but temperance of all kinds seems to have been urged. It is also stated that they had common meals, resembling the Spartan system, at which they met in companies of 10. Considerable importance seems to have been attached to music and gymnastics in the daily exercises of the disciples. The whole discipline is represented as encouraging a lofty serenity and self-possession, of which there were various anecdotes in antiquity. Iamblichus gives a long description of the daily routine of the members, which suggests many similarities with Sparta. The members of the sect showed a devoted attachment to each other, to the exclusion of those who did not belong to the ranks. There were even stories of secret symbols, by which members of the sect could recognize each other, even if they had never met before. Commentary from Sir William Smith, Dictionary of Greek and Roman Biography and Mythology. At one point, the active and organized brotherhood, the Pythagorean order, was everywhere suppressed, and did not again revive, though it was probably a long time before it was put down in all the Italian cities. Still, the Pythagoreans continued to exist as a sect, the members of which kept up among themselves the religious observances and scientific pursuits, while individuals, as in the case of Archytas, acquired now and then great political influence. Respecting the fate of Pythagoras himself, the accounts vary.